Rivals of Aether 2 is absolutely crushing it so far, and last week I made a video going over every character's best move in the game, so this week, anyone shocked by this? Let's do it. So for fairness' sake, I'm going to do the elements in reverse order from last time, starting with air for Raster, and he's a good case study anyways, because just look at him, right? He is a bird wearing aviation glasses. He's an air fighter, so I'd imagine that he's probably got some pretty good aerials that we're not going to be picking from, including his very unique aerial strong attacks, or smash attacks, which, by the way, yes, Raster can do strong attacks in the air instead of on the ground. I'm going to be a bit less explanation heavy with stuff like this compared to last week's video, so if you're new to the Rival series, you may want to consider starting there. Not a huge deal, but there will just be a bit more of a get you started element to it. I also should mention that I'm not considering any throws in this video. Any throw gets a huge benefit because it's attached to a grab, and grabs beat shields, parries, crouch canceling, counters. They're exceptionally important in Rivals 2. I guess to compensate for the first game not having them, they're making up for lost time. And it's the same deal with special get-up attacks and special ledge attacks. There are some pretty good ones, but by their nature, they're meant to be a lot more niche, and I'm not going to hold that against them. I actually think making all of them really good would probably be a mistake. So I guess we're left with his ground moves then, and as we've established, he's a very blatantly designed aerial fighter. He even has less ground moves than normal, and he doesn't even have any truly bad ground moves. Rivals of Aether 2 is first and foremost designed for competitive play, which means that generally speaking, every move on a character's kit has a purpose it serves. There are no Ganondorf up tilts on the roster, for example. That said, the closest thing Raster has to Ganondorf up tilt is his own up tilt, which pulls from the exact same Captain Falcon inspiration, and yeah, I've got to say it's still probably his worst move. It's not bad per se. Like I said, Raster can't do strong attacks on the ground at all, so one of its main considerations just seems to be giving him some kind of grounded kill move, which you would be completely lacking without this, and that's great on paper, but it's just not really what he's looking for. Sure, he's an air fighter, he likes to spend a lot of time up there, but even when he's on the ground, he just often has other stuff he'd rather be doing that confirms into his aerial kill moves instead. That's mostly facilitated by his slipstream, which speeds him way up and opens up a lot of new confirm routes while he's in it, and you may think, well, he doesn't always have slipstream up, so I guess that would be when he starts fishing for raw up tilts, but in practice, you know, he has it up an awful lot. Not every confirm requires it, and he's generally perfectly happy to just fish for stray aerials to knock you off stage for edge guards anyways, or just sit in his shield and wait to punish you from there because this air fighter also has the best out of shield game for some reason. It does have a spike on it, so at least in theory you can go for some cheesy ledge interactions and score yourself some early kills that way, and you do see Rasters do this sometimes, but it's still kind of slow to be easy to line up, and even if you do, Rivals has pretty powerful DI, and every stage has walls that you can tech off of partially specifically to avoid too many situations like this coming up. So yeah, the times where it actually pans out for him aren't all that common. Doesn't help that it's also just a bit too slow to enable really easy bread and butter confirms either. I also took a look at this thing here, his budget Meta Knight Mock Tornado, which is a substantially worse attack than Mock Tornado ever was. But you know what? This is the height his up special gets, and this is the height his neutral special gets, while also having a lot more horizontal drift, so sometimes you just have to use it to recover. And it may be risky to go for in some situations. It's pretty interceptable and pretty punishable, but even in those situations, it's better than dying, and you can fast fall with it too, so it can be a surprise disadvantage breaker. His dance special, which is obviously inspired by Falcon Kick, actually does the same thing, and it was another one I looked at. This one you do see Rasters use a bit more regularly, though. It's got pretty good payoff. It pops them straight up into the air, which is where Raster in particular really wants them to be, and it's actually got pretty good tech chase potential, stuff like that. Plus, yeah, it's another surprise momentum mix-up in disadvantage state. It's not the absolute best one in the world, and again, it's kind of punishable, but more options are never a bad thing. He's got better anti-air options, he's got better edge guarding options. Yeah, I gotta go with up tilt at the end of the day. Not a terrible move, but just outclassed. And then we have Fleet, our other air-based character, and in the same way it made sense for Raster's worst move to be a grounded option considering he's a flying fighter, I think it makes sense that Rivals 2's most blatant zoner should have a burst option as her worst move. Dash attack just doesn't really do all that much for her. Yes, it's a fast burst option, and if you have that, you're gonna make use of it sometimes, but its range is really nothing spectacular. It just doesn't launch her all that far, and even if it does connect, so what? It doesn't kill, it doesn't really combo. I guess there is some potential for tech chase setups, but even then it's pretty sketchy. This is a multi-hit move, which means it's really easy to react to and DI up. Even if that wasn't the case though, it's still laggy enough that she'd have a hard time following up on it, and that lagginess also makes it pretty unsafe on shield. It has some ambiguous cross-up potential to keep her safe, but yeah, like I said, it doesn't have the most range of any dash attacks, so that's not even super reliable. It's not the worst thing on the planet, and she'll make use of it sometimes. Again, I need to emphasize, there probably aren't going to be any truly terrible incredible moves on here, but as far as Rivals moves go, it's pretty underwhelming, and that's assuming it all even connects properly, which is not a guarantee by any means. I'm not even sure there were other candidates here, to be honest, and like I said, Fleet's a zoner. It doesn't help that dash attack is not really playing into her game plan. Now, to be fair, she's not looking to zone all the time. You can always swat her arrows away, and you can parry them and do all that kind of stuff, so for her to actually seal stocks and create real pressure, she needs to get in your face eventually. Even in those scenarios, though, okay, I'm firing side special off to create pressure, I'm rushing in. Forward air just does that job so much better. It covers more vertical space. You can control how much vertical space you want to cover if you want to try and catch them jumping out of your pressure, for example. It actually has combo potential if you connect it. You can even float in with it, her signature fantastic mobility tool that shuts off access to dash attack. Or, you know, neutral air, back air, all of which are much higher quality moves, so yeah, just use those. Yes, I'm being a bit snarky. There are definitely situations where dash attack's your best option, but seriously, whenever you can, just use those. And then we get into Craig, a heavyweight where a lot of his attacks predictably either hit like a truck or are shockingly good combo tools, or sometimes even both. One move that kind of does both, but at the same time doesn't really do either though, is forward tilt right here. Does it have some combo potential at early percents depending on how your opponent DIs? Sure, but it's not that much. Does it kill? I mean, eventually, probably. Is it a good neutral tool in brawling distance? Because the thing is, Craig has a pretty good jab and a pretty good down tilt. Now, to be fair, forward tilt does outrange both of those pretty substantially, but the reason it does that is because Craig takes a big step forward, and you know what else he does that with? Dash attack. And dash attack has even more range and much better combo potential. You can actually cancel it into tilts, including obviously forward tilt. And in practice, I'd say that's actually the main way you see this get used. It's like, okay, I've connected a dash attack. They're a bit too far away for me to follow up with most things. I'll get a forward tilt and give myself a bit of extra damage. Why not? That's fine and all, but in a game where Craig is able to do stuff like this, what is a bit of extra tacked on damage supposed to impress me? Now, in some platform fighters, forward tilts have additional utility as a really fast, easy run back and cover yourself button. Some characters in Rivals 2 can really struggle with that because of the way the dash system's implemented. Now, Craig is not really one of them, fortunately. To get easy pivot forward tilts, you need to wait until your initial dash ends, and Craig has a very short one, which works out for him in this case, and there are other universal workarounds too. You can do just a straight up pivot, which is a frame perfect input, and you are fully actionable on that one. Same deal with a baby dash, that's a 2-frame window, that's Rival specific tech. And of course the most ubiquitous one, you can wave dash. They all kind of suffer from the same universal problem though, which is that this just doesn't really keep you all that safe, again because of the big lunge forward you take afterwards. You can't even angle it. Like if you could aim this up for some anti-air potential and then down for some ledge coverage, I would get it more, but as is, it just feels like a move that you throw out in very rare situations, and it primarily exists to be a niche combo extender out of a better attack. I can say it sends his rock shards at quite a good angle, but that's about the best I can do. I did take a look at his strong attacks too, that's always worth doing, especially when they're really slow like this. That said, his forward strong here is his biggest and slowest of all of them, and it's clearly drawing inspiration from Bowser's old forward smash, but even on a base level, it's still faster and more practical, and on top of that, slow, strong moves have additional value in Rivals 2 because parries are a thing, and shield breaks are more common. So having at least one tool like that in your kit is actually a pretty decent trait. And then we've got Maple, the embodiment of the more living side of the earth, and she's got multiple moves that are based around bringing stuff out of the ground, including some very good ones, some of the better tools on her kit. When it comes to down air though, this strength starts to fall apart a little bit. I like the idea behind this move, it's very creative. She spawns a vine directly underneath her, even in situations where it doesn't really make any sense. I guess nature just finds a way. But what that means from a more practical perspective is she doesn't really have a great way to cover below her. If I turn hitboxes on and do a down air here, notice that while Maple's doing something that looks like it could potentially be an attacking animation with her body, there's not actually anything there. The attack is entirely on the vine. And that's a problem because the hitbox is pretty skinny and not all that easy to connect when your opponent's running around, and also, if you're above your opponent, that often means you're in disadvantaged state, in which case, you've got bigger things to worry about because they're often coming after you in the air below you. Guess what? The vine's not gonna do anything. Can you use it in ways that have nothing to do with disadvantaged state? Yeah, of course you can. And you know what? Depending on the exact situation, the payoff that you get can even be quite high, but that really didn't pop up all that often during my research. The vast majority of the time this was used as a general harassment tool at best, and even then, not that frequently. I went through a lot of games and sometimes even full sets where I simply did not see the Maple player throw out a down air. Some use it a lot more often than others, don't get me wrong, but it's not speaking particularly well to being a vital part of her toolkit if some good players can choose to essentially ignore it. You're not going to see any Maple players ignoring dash attack, because that move is very broadly applicable, and this is pretty niche at the end of the day. today. I also looked at her jab, which is obviously very quick, but it's also pretty stubby, and among the entire roster's jabs, it's not the highest payoff. Maple has some pretty good tilt attacks in terms of the frame data and covers they offer, but if your opponent DIs them properly, their combo potential does start going down a lot sooner than many other characters do, and if jab canceling doesn't actually care about those good properties, then what you end up with is a somewhat mediocre jab cancel. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's still a fast panic button that can provide very good payoff, which is still more than I can really say for down air. Now we're getting into the water characters, starting with Orcane the Whale Dog here, and listen, I know I've been using a lot of this character doesn't have any truly bad moves cop-outs in this video, but in Orcane's case, seriously, he has no bad moves. Everything on his kit is some kind of combination of crazy frame data monster, or gives him insane movement, or has amazing range and kill power, and it's often more than one of those, so I'm in a bit of a conundrum here. I think the move I'm forced to go with here, though, is his up special teleport, and there are a couple of reasons I'm not thrilled about that. First off, it just feels like a bit of a weak answer to choose a recovery move, and when I can avoid putting them on lists like this, I try to. And on top of that, even though it is a very laggy, risky recovery option that he can't even opt for if he doesn't have a puddle on the ground, if that puddle is well placed, it leaves his recovery options pretty open because his opponent can't possibly cover everything. So if they commit too hard to trying to cover his more conventional recovery, he can just teleport to the other side of the stage and be in the clear. On the flip side, though, it also means that Orcane's vertical mix-ups are not particularly good, and if you truly can't exhaust his recovery as far as side special goes and force him to recover with up special, you can see that coming from a mile away and get as big a punish as you want. It's not that Orcane's up special does nothing without a puddle, it does give him a little hop, and you can V-reverse that, and it gives him some decent momentum. Combine it with a wall jump, that kind of thing. Hell, you can even put a puddle on the ground and still opt to go for the jump instead if you feel like it, so it is a decent little mix-up. And if you do opt for the teleport, it's actually got quite a strong hitbox on it, which can, in certain situations, pay off. It's a bit niche, but it does pop up. But it is at least a vulnerability for Orcane, and I don't really know what else to go with. Down tilt did get nerfed, I guess, and it feels like its payoff is lower than a lot of other down tilts. If you want to get the better combo-enabling sweet spot, that's on the inner portion of the move, whereas the tipper actually launches opponents out. Still, look at that speed and coverage. Even if you're not constantly getting amazing combos off it, it's an excellent neutral tool, and in practice, Orcane players use it a lot. Up strong is probably the most niche of his strong attacks, but even then, it's still not bad. And even if you don't have a puddle extending its range, it still has some really good setups into it. It's on the niche end, but the niche it does fill, it fills extraordinarily well. This is a character who can trap you in place in the air after all, so I don't know. That feels like a weird choice too. I gotta say up special. Not thrilled about it, but there are no guilt-free answers here. Rano I'm a little more comfortable with. He's a character who's supposed to be very fast on the ground, not so fast in the air, so that would tilt me towards one of his aerials. If they weren't literally all excellent, I can't go with one of those. I think my choice here is actually gonna be one of his grounded moves, forward tilt, and the logic for this roughly lines up with Craig. Now, I don't want to overstate things. I think this is a better move than Craig's forward tilt. It definitely combos more reliably. At the same time, though, I don't want to overstate how good its combo potential is. With proper DI, this thing starts falling off way earlier than his other tilts, and on the flip side, it also won't kill. So it's in this awkward middle ground where its knockback scaling is too aggressive to make it a great combo tool past earlier percents, but at the same time, it's not aggressive enough to turn it into a kill move. Again, unlike with Craig's forward tilt, this does not make Rano take a step at all, and that means baby dash back forward tilt's a much more appealing option. And while it's not an amazing anti-air option, it does definitely have better anti-air properties than down tilt, so that's another point in its favor. But beyond those, I can't think of a lot of reasons to use this over down tilt most of the time. You might think, like with Craig, it must have better range than down tilt, and that's an intuitive thing to think about a forward tilt, but in practice, no, they're actually pretty comparable. And considering that down tilt combos forever, including into a bunch of Rano's best kill moves, and this is what happens when I try and do the same thing with forward tilt, I'm just not feeling it very much. And then I also looked at his strong attacks as usual, but not only are these just inherently pretty high quality moves, with that down throw, yeah, none of these are ever going at the bottom. And then we're just left with the fire characters, and oh, would you look at that, we still have almost half the video left. Let me just go ahead and yeah, that's looking real good. Dan, PayPal's my first choice if that works for you, but I will take wire transfer. So by Rivals 2 standards, all things considered, Zetterburn's a relatively straightforward character. You know, he hits you hard, he's got good strong attacks, he can light you on fire, and then those strong attacks get even stronger. As far as all the elemental gimmicks in the game go, his is relatively unobtrusive, and that's because he was one of the very first Rivals designed, and he's clearly supposed to be, you know, your competitive Smash player's introduction to a new game kind of character. And to accomplish that, he's still to this day probably the most direct translation of a Smash character into the Rival series. You see plenty of nods to Smash movesets splashed around, and there are a few other characters that look like analogs, but for Zetterburn in particular, he is very explicitly based on Wolf, specifically Project M Wolf. And don't get me wrong, they've definitely taken plenty of liberties, and they've managed to create a pretty cohesive feeling and decidedly distinct moveset out of it all despite that, but There are a few moves on his kit that do sort of feel like they're there, mostly just because Wolf did something similar, and I think Forward Tilt here embodies that the most, right down to the multi-hit nature, as well as not really contributing all that much to his core game plan. One of Zetterburn's bigger weaknesses is that a lot of his attacks have relatively short range, which makes up for how good he is once he manages to get in your face. Forward Tilt addresses that problem a little bit. It does have more range than most of his moves, but its overall range is still not particularly great, and even if you land it, it doesn't do that much for him. You can get some combos off it, especially if your opponent hard DIs in, but like I brought up before, this is a multi-hit, and that means it's far easier to react to, and that also applies if you're trying to kill with it, which is just not that great at to begin with. One of Zetterburn's strengths as a character is how early he can take stock, so this right here, by his standards, he's feeling pretty sad about that. So as the third Forward Tilt on the list, it is sharing some common ground with Craig and Rano. Now, I will say this is the best of them as far as I'm concerned. It has a lot more to contribute overall, and it takes on more of an unexciting but acceptable jack-of-all-trades role as opposed to just being a really niche tool. It helps that you can angle this one, which really does boost its utility up a good amount, especially the downward angled variant at the ledge. It's not the only way he has to cover it, but you know, it's relatively quick and non-committal and has a decent hitbox. It's honestly not bad. And hey, even if the payoff isn't fantastic, more range is still more range. It doesn't have as much range as his forward strong does, but that's way more committal, obviously. Honestly, this one's more of a victim of circumstance than anything else, because literally every single one of his aerials is fantastic, near the top of its category as far as I'm concerned. A lot of his playstyle is defined by his strong attacks, so those aren't really going anywhere. His special moves are more broadly applicable. Now, what I will say is you could make a bit of a case for up special, because one of Zetterburn's other weaknesses is recovering. I don't really think that's necessarily up special's fault in a vacuum, though. The thing is, yes, it is based on Fox's recovery, which is somewhat notoriously exploitable, but I'd argue Zetterburn's is actually way better because it starts up much faster, and he still gets to keep all the tricky mix-ups with the different recovery angles, which now are substantially harder to position yourself to try and cover. I would argue that up special is actually pulling its weight. The issue is that his other mix-ups are basically just a little bit of shine stalling, and then he's got the down B cancel stuff, and that's pretty much it. And you know, if he was stuck with, say, a Rano up special, or a Raster up special, a Maple up special, probably Fleet, he'd likely be in an even worse position, so I don't really know how you can blame up special for his problems. If anything, blame this for putting him into freefall. Imagine how much stronger his recovery would be if he could start up special anywhere through that dive. So yeah, I'm sticking to Forward Tilt, and there's nothing really all that wrong with it. I'd probably call it the best worst move I've looked at today. Everything else is just better. Claire, I would say, actually finds herself in kind of a similar situation to Zetterburn, where she's allowed to have a full toolkit of mostly very good moves with one key trade-off. In his case, it's range. In her case, it's frame data. As a general rule of thumb, her attacks are pretty slow and don't provide all that much shield pressure. The first move that comes to mind for me here is Dash Attack, which yes, has quite good range, and it's her only real burst option. You know, she's got Forward Special, which is technically a burst move, but its hitbox is where she starts out rather than where she ends up. But it's very, for lack of a better term, finicky. It's got weird hitbox placements that don't start up right away. It's risky to go for it because it's just got so much ending lag on it that your opponent can easily punish this if they shield it or just get out of the way, jump over it, or move back, which happens constantly, especially because the hitbox takes so long to come out on this thing. And that also means that lining the tipper up on an opponent who's actually moving around can be tricky. Now, you are rewarded for getting around all that. It sends your opponent straight up, so there is big combo potential there. And while a lot of the time hitting the sour spot doesn't honestly lead to too much, you know, sometimes it will. You can even technically kill confirm off it. And it also gets a bit of a boost because it's your primary extender out of tipper down tilt. Now, that doesn't last a super long time. With proper DI, at least, that often starts falling off surprisingly quickly, but it's still a point in its favor. And when you stack all that stuff together, I don't think I can pick it. It's still easily her worst ground move as far as I'm concerned, but it does a decent amount in some situations. It plays decently well into her role as a very dash dancing footsies heavy character. It's like, oh, this is the zone you think I'm in? Psych! So you could do worse. So what I think is actually her worst move, and it pains me to do this because it's pretty cool, is this right here, her very unique counter. Claren has no projectiles in her moveset, and that counters the reason why, because the plasma field it creates simply eats any projectile that enters it. She's actually the only character with no kind of range option, which means that outside of the Ditto, that anti-projectile property always has a use case, and in some matchups is a total game changer. Fleet, for example, a character who heavily relies on projectiles, including some slow-moving and predictable ones, that just shuts down a substantial part of her toolkit for quite a long time. There are plenty of other matchups, though, where it's not that big a deal. Like, sure, Maple would like to be able to freely throw seeds at you all the time, but if she has to stop for a few seconds, it's not the end of the world, and she can even still apply her Watcher's Mark with other melee attacks in the meantime. Still, if Clarion could get this up for free in that matchup constantly, she'd be happy, but she can't. It is a counter after all, and like with any counter, if you whiff it, you're probably in trouble. Well, for Maple specifically, it's a bit easier because you can counter the plant, but you get what I mean. It's also very stage dependent. On the smaller stages, if you can manage to activate this in the middle, you can cover basically the entire thing and create a true anti-projectile situation for a bit. On larger stages though, not so much, and the thing is, if your projectile equipped opponent opts to just not engage for a bit, what are you gonna do? You can't force approaches, you don't have a projectile. Now, to its credit, the anti-projectile thing isn't all it does. It stalls you in the air for a bit so you can use that as a mix-up while you're recovering. It's not the most necessary thing in the world when you've got neutral special, which can already do that, but it's an option. Now, that stall also leaves you even more vulnerable if you whiff it in the air, but you know, on the other hand, Clarion's also the only character with some kind of aerial parry variant. So that is a tool she can access, and it actually has combo potential. If you land this, your reward is not just the plasma field. Even without landing a combo, it still has, say, potential edge guarding applications other characters don't have access to. It doesn't deal a ton of knockback, but in some circumstances, a little's all you need. So it always has at least some application, even in the Ditto, but that said, this is still probably the overall most polarizing move in Rivals 2. Your mileage really varies depending on exactly who and where you're fighting, and you also can't forget that it's an exceptionally committal option in an extremely fast-paced game, and on the ground, it's also competing against conventional parries, which Clarion, of course, can still do. And I think it's kind of telling that even in a lot of situations where this would be viable to activate, in matchups where it's beneficial, it's still not particularly rare to see Clarion players just opt for a parry instead. That's a level of competition that most moves in this game just don't have to deal with, so to the bottom it goes. We got Forceburn next, our penultimate character here, and let's not beat around the bush with this one. His worst move is Up Strong because it doesn't fucking work. Forceburn tournament VODs are just painful to study because the first thing you notice is the two halves of this just constantly failing to connect properly, and the second thing you notice is Forceburn players increasingly just giving up on using it entirely. It's a rough life out here. Even in a lab environment, it's just not hard to set this up to whiff. The knockback that you need is so specific. On paper it's fine, this giant sweeping disjointed anti-air, it's actually quite good, maybe even too good, especially when you can also do up tilt combos, for example. And maybe that's why they decided to add some inconsistency in to help balance it out. I would say they probably went too far with it though. DI just plays too big a role here. And you could say, hey, it's up to you to know whether it'll connect, and if you nail what their DI is going to be and what position they'll be in once the cape actually comes out, because remember, it's slow, you might even be able to scrounge together some other worse payoff. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but that's not really sounding like a beating the worst move allegations argument to me. His other cape move, Forward Strong, has its own problems. It's extremely susceptible to crouch canceling for one, and it definitely has its own issues with the knockback. Generally speaking though, I would call it much more predictable, and you can compensate more comfortably if you know you landed it too close to get the knife blade to connect, for example. Also, make no mistake, Up Strong is also extremely susceptible to crouch canceling. You just don't see it pop up as often. Partially because people almost never use it because it doesn't fucking work. Under normal circumstances, this would be yet another forward tilt on the table. Yeah, sure, it creates smoke, which Forceburn likes, but it's not that rewarding on hit. It's a multi-hit, which means it's easy to react to with DI as usual, and it can be a bit inconsistent by itself. Its range isn't half bad, but it's still a bit on the leggy side to be particularly safe. So yeah, it's not a brilliant move, but Up Strong doesn't fucking work. And it's as simple as that. And then we're just left with Loxodont, who was one of the tougher calls for me. His up air feels incredibly mediocre. It sends the opponent absolutely nowhere, and I don't really know why it works like this, and they still felt the need to put a sour spot on it for some reason. But you know, it's still a huge disjointed juggling tool, so that's definitely something. Seriously, 4 of his 5 aerials can be described as a giant elephant swinging an axe at you, and only one of them has any kind of real kill power behind it. I don't know why he's designed this way, but he's got to work with the tools he has. So then my attention turns to his actual kill moves here, and my first thought was Forward Strong, and I'm not charging it. It is just that slow, and as you can see, Loxodont does not die here. Now, to be fair, he's a heavy character, but still, 90%, 100+% on a move with this kind of frame data, that's pretty underwhelming. Do I need to remind you what Ganondorf's Forward Smash does in Smash Ultimate, which is a far slower paced game? And just to add to the mediocrity, that's the sweet spot I landed before, because this move also has a sour spot on it, and that just sucks. So that was kind of my instinctive pick, but interestingly, we actually had a Loxodont just make grand finals at a major, and if you watch his run in particular, he's really not that shy about just letting it rip. And if you look at other good Loxodont players, it's not too different a story. This is the kind of character where you just have to be willing to take big swings sometimes. And it can actually be fairly intimidating to get around, especially at the ledge, and especially if he has a lava charge, which boosts his power up even more and greatly extends the duration of its hitbox. So suddenly, you've actually got a bit of a wall in your face. And on top of that, if it's spaced properly in that state, it can be not necessarily totally safe, but surprisingly difficult to punish. Are Hail Mary forward strong still going to be the play 10 years from now? Probably not, but everything I'm talking about in this video could be patched next week. Who cares? So I think that actually walks back my call. Now, up strong, I would call his best strong attack overall. I think it does a lot of what forward strong is trying to do, except better because it hits through platforms more effectively and it kills off the top, and Loxodon can actually get some pretty decent confirms into it, so I don't really want to go with that. Down strong, though, his final strong attack, this, I think, is going to be the one. Because here's the thing, yes, Loxodon does have multiple moves that are guaranteed to set up tech situations at a minimum, and you do see down strong used in those scenarios sometimes, but even there, it's not always that good. Its coverage isn't nearly enough. It still has good coverage, and if you connect it, depending on how your opponent DIs, it can kill off the top or the side, and the front hit and the back hit are different, but you can see the payoff there is not insane, and while it may be much quicker to start up than forward strong, its lag is honestly about as bad. It's actually only got 2 frames less end lag despite having substantially less reward for landing it. You can land it more easily, but it's still not that easy. Does being powered up help? It does not. It's got a role to play, and covering an entire platform in particular is quite nice. You do see Loxodon players do that, but they use every move in his kit, genuinely. Okay, let me phrase it this way. If you're a coward, then forward strong is his worst move. But if you're a real gamer, it's gotta be down strong. What, you're trying to play smart and cover both sides of yourself? No, no, no. You're playing the funny elephant. We commit when we play the funny elephant. And that'll do it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. I've been having a blast with Rivals 2 so far. Let me know what you thought of the list and the game. Likes and comments are huge for boosting a video on YouTube's algorithm, so if you think this one deserves it, much appreciated. You can check out the best of counterpart for this video here, a Zelda moveset video on MockRock here, and patrons, members, and subs get perks like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.